What if the most powerful story of the Wild West wasn't about outlaws, but about two strangers who were never meant to meet? In 1885, on the edge of the Arizona frontier, Clara Wynn lived alone, until a rising cloud of dust brought an Apache man named Rafe Nez to her gate. And nothing in her world stayed the same. The spring of 1885 arrived in the Arizona Territory like a restless breath, warm, sharp, carrying the smell of mesquite and distant rain. Clara Wynn wiped her forehead with the back of her glove as she drove another nail into the fence rail. Since her father died the previous winter, the ranch had felt too large, too quiet, and too determined to fall apart all at once. She had spent the morning mending boards, tightening wire, and reminding herself she could manage alone. She always had. But then she saw it, dust rising on the far edge of her land. Not the swirling kind the wind made, but a straight, steady column. A rider. Clara straightened, heart tightening as she reached for the Winchester leaning against the corral. Visitors rarely came this way, and the ones who did usually wanted something more than directions. She kept the rifle angled across her body as the figure on horseback slowed, shapes forming through the haze. The dun mare first, then the silhouette of a man riding tall in the saddle. He stopped a good 30 yards from her gate, and raised his right hand, palm outward. A silent, peaceful greeting. He was striking in a way that startled her more than she cared to admit. Broad-shouldered, long-limbed, his sleeveless buckskin vest leaving powerful arms bare to the sun. His skin was bronze from endless miles outdoors. A single raven feather hung from the end of the black braid over his shoulder. His face carried the quiet intensity of someone who had seen more than most men live through. "Morning," he called. His voice was deep, steady, edged with an accent she couldn't place. "You're on private land," Clara replied, not lowering the rifle. "I know." He nodded once. "Name's Rafe Nez. My mare threw a shoe 2 days back. Haven't had a warm meal since. Thought I might trade some work for food." Clara studied him carefully. The knife at his belt. The weariness in his stance. The way his gaze never hit anything but didn't give away too much either. "He-W." Clara woke before sunrise, as she always did, expecting the familiar silence of the ranch. But when she stepped outside with her coffee, she saw movement in the corral. Rafe Nez was already awake, crouched beside the rail he'd repaired yesterday, his hand running along the wood as if checking the spine of a living creature. His mare grazed quietly behind him, dew gathering on her whiskers. "You start early," Clara said. Rafe looked up with that small, unreadable nod of his. "Sun's up. Work's up." She didn't know why it made her smile, but it did. The north roof needed patching, so she showed him the ladder behind the lean-to. He carried it as though it weighed nothing, propping it against the barn and climbing without hesitation. Clara kept busy mending a feed sack, though her attention drifted toward him more than once. The rhythmic hammering, the way he moved with calm certainty, the way he always seemed aware of everything around him without ever appearing tense. When he came down, dusting off his hands, he simply asked, "What else?" "You don't stop, do you?" she teased. "Not while the light's good," he replied. They tightened the chicken wire coop next, Rafe teaching her a trick to twist the wire without slicing her palms. He gave her a small scrap of leather to grip the sharp edges. "Your hands will thank you later," he murmured. It struck her then. he wasn't just working. He was quietly teaching her to make things easier tomorrow than they were yesterday. Her father had done that. No one else had. By noon, the coop was secure, and Clara ladled out the leftover stew, adding bread she'd baked the night before. Rafe sat on the porch steps to eat. Like yesterday, he didn't rush. He ate as if food was a kind of respect. "You always this slow?" she asked. "Food's not something to hurry." Her father had said that exact sentence once. She wasn't ready for the ache it stirred. After lunch, Rafe rinsed his bowl at the trough using a cloth from his own pack. The morning broke clean and bright, the kind of desert light that sharpened every stone and shadow. Clara stepped onto the porch with her coffee, expecting to find Rafe near the shed. Instead, he was saddling his mare, tightening the last strap with practiced ease. "Going somewhere?" she asked. He glanced back at her. "Mesquite bloom should be near the river by now. Bees will be working. Good sign for planting." She raised a brow. "You want to check on flowers?" "Not just flowers." He mounted smoothly. "You can tell a season's worth from how the bees move." Clara hesitated. The north pasture still needed clearing. The hinges on the smokehouse door were hanging crooked. But a small part of her, the part that had been asleep for months, leaned forward at his quiet invitation. "You coming?" he asked. She swallowed. "Give me a minute." They rode slow, the morning still cool enough that the horses' breaths made faint puffs in the air. The trail dipped into a wash where the soil turned dark and rich. Rafe pointed out plants along the way. Wild onions tangled near a fallen log, prickly pear pads budding with new growth, yucca stalks rising tall and proud. "Root makes good soap," he said, nodding at the yucca. "Saved my hide once when river water ran low." Clara laughed softly. "Never thought of soap as something you find. In the desert, everything's something you find or make." They crossed the San Pedro at a shallow bend. The stones were slick, the current quick, but Rafe's mare moved steady and fearless. On the far bank, the mesquite grove waited, low trees, branches heavy with pale yellow blossoms. The air hummed, a soft, pulsing drone of bees moving from flower to flower. Rafe dismounted and tied his reins to a crooked branch. Clara tried to do the same but fumbled the knot. He stepped over, quiet amusement flickering in his eyes. "That won't hold anything heavier than a chicken," he murmured, hands working the rope into a snug, smooth knot. "There, Clara." The first sign came with the wind. It was late afternoon, the sun still bright, when a hot gust swept across the yard, lifting the dust in sharp spirals. Clara straightened from the woodpile, narrowing her eyes. The air had shifted, sudden, electric, carrying the smell of rain that didn't belong to a clear sky. Rafe emerged from behind the chicken coop, wiping his hands on a strip of cloth. His gaze shot to the southern horizon. "Mountains are pulling the storm in fast." Clara followed his stare. A massive wall of dark cloud crawled over the ridges, bruised purple and rolling like a living thing. "It wasn't supposed to rain until next week," she said. Rafe shook his head. "Desert doesn't keep a calendar." Before she could respond, the wind doubled, snapping the laundry on the line like gunshots. Rafe swung onto his mare and kicked into a fast ride toward the pasture. "I'll check the river," he called over the rising gale. Clara hurried to grab the last of the sheets, the fabric whipping against her arms as she fought to haul it inside. The sky dimmed to an unnatural blue, too dark for the hour, too heavy for comfort. The first rumble of thunder cracked so close it made her teeth ring. Minutes later, Rafe appeared in the gate, soaked through, rain streaking down his braid. "That river is climbing hard," he said, breathless. "If it keeps rising, the low pasture will flood within the hour." "We don't keep stock down there," Clara said, but her voice felt thin beneath the roar of wind. "Doesn't matter. When the bank cuts, it'll take your fence with it." Lightning split the sky, blinding white. The thunder that followed shook the ground. Rain turned fierce, slanting sideways, stinging Clara's cheeks like thrown sand. Rafe threw a blanket over his mare and followed her toward the cabin. They ducked inside as the storm slammed against the door behind them. The air inside was warm, but Clara shivered anyway. She rummaged in the old trunk and pulled out one of his. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean and humming with new scents. For the first time in months, Clara woke to the soft smell of damp earth instead of dust. The San Pedro ran lower and clearer the next morning, its edges heavy with willow and cottonwood shaking off the last of the rain. Clara and Rafe fell easily back into work. But something had shifted between them, quietly, deeply. When she handed him tools, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away too quickly. When he spoke, his voice carried a subtle warmth she hadn't heard before. And when she caught his eye, he didn't look away. It was a delicate change, like the softening of soil before a seed breaks through. Around mid-morning a familiar clatter sounded on the road. Clara looked up to see a young boy from town, a rider barely 16, approaching on a skinny bay horse. He tipped his hat, cheeks red from the ride. "Message from Mrs. Hensley," he said, handing Clara a folded paper. "She's planning the spring dance." Clara almost laughed. She had forgotten that Benson still held such things. Lanterns strung outside the schoolhouse, fiddle music spilling into the night, women in cotton dresses they'd sewn themselves. She unfolded the paper. The dance was in 2 weeks. "You going?" the boy asked, grinning like he already knew the answer. "I don't know," she said. "Folks been asking after you," he added. "Be good to see you there." He touched his hat again and rode off, leaving Clara staring at the paper as if it were written in a foreign tongue. When she looked up, Rafe was watching her from the shed doorway. "What's a spring dance?" he asked. Clara tucked the paper into her apron. "Music. Food. Half the town shows up. You like them?" "I used to," she admitted. "Before things changed." That night, over coffee on the porch, the subject returned. "You thinking about going?" Rafe asked. "I'm not sure." Clara shrugged. "Feels strange. People remember me from before. Quiet girl with a pie." The weeks after the spring dance unfolded like the slow turning of a river, steady, natural, almost unnoticed until Clara realized how much had changed. Rafe didn't ask if he should stay. Clara didn't ask if he planned to leave. He simply rose each morning at first light, saddled his mare, and started on whatever needed doing. And Clara found herself brewing a second cup of coffee without thinking, placing it on the porch rail where he always reached for it. 2 mugs instead of 1. 2 sets of boots by the door. two shadows moving across the yard at sunrise. Life, quiet, unspoken life, was forming in the spaces between them. Rafe built new shelving for the pantry from mesquite boards he planed himself. Clara began stitching a second quilt from flour sacks and worn shirts of his that had frayed beyond saving. Some days they worked side by side. Other days they drifted through separate chores, meeting again at supper as if the day had been waiting for that moment all along. One early summer morning, the back plot shimmered with green, rows of beans, squash, and corn pushing through the softened soil. Clara stood with her hands on her hips, chin lifting with pride she hadn't felt in years. "You did good with the planting," Rafe said behind her. "We did good," she corrected. He gave a small smile, the kind that warmed slowly, like coals catching flame. Later that afternoon, he took a net down to the river. Clara followed with a basket, watching him wade into the shallows with the easy confidence of a man raised by water and stone. He hauled the net up in one smooth pull, silver fish twisting like caught light. "We'll smoke these," he said. "Winter's always closer than it feels." "You think ahead more than anyone I've met," Clara teased. Rafe shrugged. "Storms don't warn you twice." She didn't miss the meaning behind his words. Not all storms came from the sky. The seasons warmed. The land thrummed with quiet promise. Rafe built a small pen for goats after a pa. Autumn crept slowly into the San Pedro Valley, brushing gold along the cottonwoods and cooling the nights just enough for Clara to reach for the quilt Rafe had helped her stitch. Life had settled into a comforting rhythm: morning chores, work in the fields, suppers shared by lamplight, and the quiet closeness of two people who no longer pretended to live separate lives. But steadiness has its own way of stirring old ghosts. It was just after sundown when the trouble first arrived. Clara was stacking kindling near the porch when she heard hoofbeats, fast, uneven, carrying tension in each strike of the ground. Rafe looked up from sharpening his knife. His eyes narrowed long before the rider reached the gate. It was Luis Mendoza, the trader who had thrown barbed comments weeks earlier. This time, two men rode behind him, both armed openly. Mendoza reined in with a careless smirk, his horse tossing its head. "Well now," Mendoza drawled. "Seems the rumors weren't lying. You are still here, Nez." Rafe didn't stand, didn't flinch. He simply set the knife down beside him. "What do you want, Mendoza?" Mendoza's grin widened, thin and mean. "Heard a patrol from the fort is coming through next week. They're asking questions about an Apache scout who deserted after the war ended." His eyes slid to Clara. "Thought you might like to know the company you're keeping." Clara felt something cold coil in her stomach. "Rafe?" she whispered. But Rafe's face didn't change. Only his voice did, quiet, controlled, edged with something she hadn't heard before. "I didn't desert." Mendoza shrugged. "Depends who's telling the tale. The army said you vanished with half their maps. Some folks say you've helped your own people outrun their cavalry for months." "And what do you say?" Rafe asked. Mendoza leaned forward in the saddle. "I say you won't be welcome when the soldiers pass through. Not here. Not anywhere." Clara stepped forward, anger flaring hot. "Get off my property, Luis." "Mend." The soldiers never came. Or if they passed through Benson, they did so quietly, hearing nothing from townsfolk who had already made up their minds about Clara Wynn and the Apache who worked beside her. Mendoza returned once, weeks later, riding slow past the property with that same snake-thin smirk, but Rafe stood at the gate, hands steady on the fence rail. Mendoza looked, hesitated, and rode on. Fear, Clara learned, rarely survived when met with a person who refused to bend to it. Life settled again, slow, steady, like water carving a familiar path through rock. Winter came soft that year. Cold enough to keep the nights sharp, but not cold enough to kill the late squash or freeze the eggs in the coop. Clara and Rafe worked through the season without speaking much of the past, or of soldiers, or of the names he'd been called by men like Mendoza. Some scars didn't need words. Some healed in silence. And yet something unspoken between them had deepened, thickened, become less of a fragile hope and more of a shared truth. One night, when the wind curled around the corners of the cabin, Rafe sat carving a small cradle board from a piece of pine. Clara mended a torn shirt beside him, though she found herself watching the gentle surety of his hands more than her stitching. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly. Rafe's knife paused over the wood. He glanced at her, eyes calm. "Every day." He set the carving down. "What were you thinking?" Clara swallowed. "About staying. Both of us. As something more than what we are now." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then Rafe reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist with a tenderness that steadied every trembling part of her. "I've already chosen to stay," he said quietly. "The question is whether you want a life with me, not just a season." "I do," she whispered. He leaned forward, kissing her with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And Clara felt something else. The years that followed should have been peaceful. And for a time they were. The valley settled into its familiar rhythms, warm summers heavy with bees, quiet winters filled with smoke and pine resin, and springs blooming soft as a promise. Lena learned to walk, then to run, then to climb everything her small hands could reach. Clara sometimes watched her daughter race across the yard with a wild, bright laugh and wondered how life so lonely could have ever grown into this. But the frontier never stayed calm for long. It began subtly, like the low tremble of distant hooves before you can hear them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Rafe stood near the fence line staring toward the southern horizon. Clara came up behind him, brushing her fingers along his arm. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't look away. "Riders. 2 of them. They've been circling the valley for days." Clara's breath caught. "Mendoza?" "No," Rafe said. "Strangers." That should have eased her, but the tightness in Rafe's jaw said otherwise. The next morning, when Clara went to fetch water, she saw it, fresh tracks along the wash. Not from townsfolk. Not from traders. Too deliberate. Too careful. Hooves placed light, riders avoiding the main road. She took a shaky breath and returned to the house, but Rafe already knew. "They're scouting," he said quietly. "For what?" He hesitated. "For someone." Clara felt something cold gather in her chest. "For you?" Rafe didn't answer. He didn't need to. 3 days later, the strangers finally showed themselves. Clara was in the garden when Lena tugged her sleeve and pointed. 2 men on horseback rode up from the riverbed, one older with a deep scar across his cheek, the other young but tense as a coiled rope. Their horses were dusted in miles. Their eyes sharper than any trader's. Ray stepped out onto the porch, placing himself between the riders and Clara without thinking. The older man reined in. Rafe Nez? Rafe's voice stayed. For a full week after the soldier's visit, the valley held its breath. Clara felt it every morning when she stepped outside, the stillness too sharp, the air too watchful. Even the goats seemed uneasy, bleating at sounds she couldn't hear. Rafe slept lightly, waking at the faintest movement, the fire knife always within reach. Lena sensed it too. She clung to Clara's skirts and stared toward the road with wide, uncertain eyes. On the fourth morning, Rafe returned from checking the northern ridge with a look Clara had seen only once before, years ago, when a flash flood nearly swept away their corral. "They're back," he said. Clara froze. "The soldiers?" "No." He shook his head. "Someone worse." He laid a folded piece of cloth on the table, dark blue wool with brass thread edging. A cavalry jacket sleeve. Clara's voice came out thin. "Where did you find it?" "Caught on a mesquite branch." Rafe's jaw clenched. "They're watching the ridge. Waiting." "For what?" she whispered. Rafe didn't answer right away. He poured a cup of water, drank, then set it down with a controlled calm that frightened her more than anger ever could. "For me. But maybe not just for me." Clara's breath hitched. "Why?" "You told them no. You said you wouldn't lead them to any camps. That's why." He looked out the window, eyes narrowing at something distant. "They're not here to arrest me, Clara. They're here to use me." She reached for him, taking his hand. "They can't force you. You're not part of their war anymore." Rafe's silence said otherwise. That afternoon, Clara found Hollis and the younger soldier down by the river. They didn't see her at first. She stayed hidden behind a fallen cottonwood trunk. "He knows these hills better than any map," Hollis said. "Command wants the remaining free families located before winter." "And you think he'll help?" the younger man asked. "He will," Hollis replied, tightening the cinch on his saddle. "One way or another. Nobody stays out here." Clara didn't remember saddling the mare. She didn't remember throwing a blanket across Lena, whispering to stay inside, or grabbing the rifle her father once used to chase coyotes off the chicken coop. All she remembered was the rising smoke, thin, dark, wrong. The mare galloped across the valley with a fear Clara hadn't felt since she was a girl. Each thud of hooves echoed Rafe's name in her chest. The ridge grew closer, sharper, carved with morning shadows that felt like warnings. When she reached the base, she slid from the saddle and climbed. Her boots slipped on loose stone, hands scraping against the rock as she pulled herself upward. Every breath was a burn. She crested the ridge just as the wind shifted, blowing the smoke into her face. Then she saw them. 2 soldiers. One slumped against a boulder, clutching a bloodied arm. The other pacing, cursing, scanning the trees. And beyond them, a scuffle of footprints. A trail leading into the pines. Rafe's tracks. Fresh. Fast. Running. "Damn Apache blindsided us," the wounded soldier spat. "He's headed deeper into the valley." Clara's pulse thundered. Rafe wasn't hurt, not badly, if he was running, but something had happened. Something that left one soldier bleeding and one furious. Clara raised her rifle. "Where is he?" Both men froze. The pacing one turned slowly, disbelief cutting across his face. "Ma'am, put that down. Tell me where he went." He lifted his hands. "Listen, the army just wants him to answer questions. We didn't come to A sharp whistle pierced the air. A moment later, Rafe stepped out from between the pines, bow drawn, arrow nocked, breathing hard but steady. A scrape along his temple bled down his cheek, but his eyes were alive with fire. "Clara," he said, voice low, warning. "Step back." The soldiers stiffened. Clara kept the rifle raised. "No. I'm not going anywhere without you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rafe spoke. "They followed me past the